Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to First Church West Campus and to our Tri-County Network event as we come to learn more about what's up with United Methodist Church. I am the Reverend Kay Scarborough, the senior pastor here at First Church, and we are so glad that you have taken time to be here this afternoon. Feel free to get up and help yourself to refreshments at any point in time. You are welcome to do that. And for your information, the restrooms are down the hallway. There is one just behind back here that is a unisex one, and then there's separate ones down the hall there. So help yourself to those as necessary. And if there's anything else we can answer questions about, you just let us know about that type of thing. We'll let them answer the rest of the questions later. So I am going to open with a prayer, and then I'll introduce Ann Spangler to you for just a minute. All right, let's pray. Holy God, we are grateful for this beautiful day. We are grateful for the sun that shines outside and for your sun that shines in our lives and in our hearts. And we pray, oh God, that your wisdom will come upon all of us this day, that we may have your spirit among us, a spirit that says that we are full of love and full of welcome and hospitality to one another, that we may be open to conversation, and whether we agree or disagree, that we can be of one mind in you, and that is that we care about each other. In Jesus' name we pray these things, and the people said, Amen. This is Ann Spangler. She's with our Justice Ministry team, and she has just some information for you.
There we go. Thank you, Kay. So, as Kay said, I've been part of our Justice Ministry team and our Justice Matters team in our congregation for a number of years. And in February of 2020, we hosted an event in this space that was on the same topic. We called it a courageous conversation, where those that attended, we invited around the district. We had about 100 folks that showed up from all across our district, involved in a conversation around full inclusion of the LGBTQ community, specifically around ordination and marriage. And then COVID hit, and everything stopped. So we have had conversations about what's next. And so with Kay's assistance and leadership, we have two speakers with us today. And the event that we're having today is not the same as what we did 2 years ago. It's not going to be like in round tables with dialogue. This is an opportunity for us to get updates and for our questions to get answered. So we have cards. This is Janelle in the back, Janelle Johnson. We have cards and pens. If something during the dialogue that we have with our speakers, something comes to mind that you would like an answer, jot it down, and then we'll also have an opportunity for an open mic. But we have this opportunity for us to get some questions answered. I know, greeting some people earlier as they came in, they walked in the door and said, I have questions. And I said, I do too. So we hope you'll come away with some answers. So we can get to it. I want to introduce our speakers, our guests for today. Reverend David Livingston. He grew up United Methodist as the son of two longtime Methodists. And after 4 years working in youth ministry, he began serving as a pastor in 1998. Appointments have taken him to an open country church, large churches in Kansas City, everything in between, including here. He was an associate pastor at First United Methodist. Before this building was opened, we had an alternative place where we held this worship, but he was part of that. He served churches that identify as very progressive and much more traditional, and he served as General Conference Delegate in 1996, 2016, 2019, as an alternate in 2008, and has worked closely with global leadership on moving the denomination past our current impasse into a more inclusive future. So, David, thank you for being here.
That's good to be here.
In addition, we have Randall Hodgkinson, who is a member at First Church Topeka, and he's currently serving as an associate conference lay leader. He's an attorney by professional training, and we're just thrilled that you both are here because you will also be a general conference delegate with the next general conference that's happening. So with that, we're going to turn this over and see what's happening next with the United Methodist Church.
Great, thanks, Ann. Is my mic on? Okay, I'm not used to these earphone mics. David preaches with that every week, but it's new for me. So if I'm not heard, please let me know. So thank you for having us here. It's good to be talking with people. It's good to be talking with people in the same room at all.
Yes.
And so I'm very thankful to be here. I did want to just sort of introduce us with some sort of ways that we might have our discussion. And I just want to recognize a few things about our discussion. That the words that we use matter. And so, for example, labels that we can put on issues or things like that, I think matter. And so, I think we're going to try to use labels today that people use for themselves. So I might describe myself as a progressive, and I think David describes himself as a progressive. And so we might describe ourselves that way. We might describe other people as traditionalists. And that's the word I will probably use today because I think that's how traditionalists describe themselves. And we might have other words or descriptions for people, but I just want to be careful about our language that we use. And I also want to be conscious of the fact that we're having discussions about issues, except for some people it's not issues, it's them, it's people. And just to be aware of that. And maybe particularly be aware, two straight white guys up here talking today about things. And so I want to take a minute to recognize that even this discussion is harmful in some ways for some people because it feels like they're being talked about as opposed to talked with, I think. And so I just want to recognize that. I don't know the right answer for that because we still have things and decisions to make. And so it's an issue too, but it's not just an issue, I guess is how I would introduce it, and be aware of that even as we have our discussions today. So Dave and I talked on Zoom about what we might talk about. Let's see, we have 90 minutes. Is it 90? No, 80 minutes left. And so this is my teacher coming out. How long do I have to? That's right. So, and so we weren't sure, but we thought we'd take a little bit of time talking about sort of history and background. I think the title was, What's Up with the UMC was the title of this program. And we'd take a little bit of time to talk about how we got here. And I know some of you already probably know maybe a lot about this, but we thought it was worth some time to take this. It's hard because David and I are sort of immersed in it and have been for a while, David longer than I. And so some of these things, it's like, it's just, we lived through a lot of these things. But not everybody has, and sometimes we forget that. It's like, oh, you don't know this thing. We just were assuming it. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about history, and then we'll sort of talk about where we're at, and then maybe we'll have some time to talk about where we might go, and then we'll have some time for questions. Really have time for questions anytime through here. There's the cards, but you could also just ask us questions. So I'm going to talk about the period from 1972 to 2012. David's going to talk about 2016 to 2013, a much shorter period. 2016 and 2019, a shorter period, but a lot to talk about. I will talk about the protocol that was and still is being discussed. David's going to talk a little bit about our postponed General Conference from 2020 and what that might mean for some of our other conferences. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the birth of the Global Methodist Church today, its birthday, and what that might mean for some churches, both in and outside of our networks. And then we'll talk a little bit about what we think these things mean for us as individual, either lay members or clergy members, maybe, what it means for our local churches, what it means for our annual conference, and what it means maybe for our larger church. So that seems like a lot for 80 minutes. But let's see. Who knows? Maybe we'll get it all done. So from a historical standpoint, some of you, if you've studied your history, and by the way, I have my book of discipline here, my 2016 book of discipline. And the first 45 pages of the book of discipline are really interesting if you've never read them, because it's a lot of the history of the Methodist Church, including the United Methodist Church. And we can learn a lot about our history in there. For what we're talking about today, about the status of our church, and particularly the status of inclusiveness for LGBTQ plus persons in the life of our church, we can kind of look back in our history to 1972. You may know that our United Methodist Church came to be in 1968 with the merger of the United Methodist Church and the EUB Church. And as early as 1972, in our 4-year quadrenniums, we started having discussions about potential social principles for our church. And in fact, in our book of discipline, we have all sorts of social principles about all sorts of issues, like the environment and treatment of women and race and war and abortion and every controversial topic you can think of. They were thinking of in 1972 and before. And so our church had to make a decision, and General Conference is the body that gets to make those sort of decisions on behalf of our entire church. And so our church was presented with proposals for all sorts of social principles in that first quadrennium in 1972, and one of them had to do with human sexuality. And from the floor, which was actually 1972, so we can think about like timing, history, pretty deep in the civil rights era then. So the proposal that had come forward to General Conference was actually a very pretty inclusive proposal. And then from the floor of the General Conference came an amendment to pass what we now call sometimes the incompatibility clause, the idea that homosexual conduct is incompatible with Christian teaching. And that part of our book of discipline. And so there was a motion made from the floor, it didn't go through the regular process, from the floor of General Conference to add this to our social principle on human sexuality, and it passed on the floor of General Conference in 1972. And it's been a subject of discussion ever since, for 50 years now. So every quadrennium after 1972, there have been discussions, persons advocating to have that incompatibility language removed, and persons advocating for keeping that incompatibility language. And in fact, in subsequent quadrennia, there have been additional provisions added to the Book of Discipline that gave a more concrete reality to that incompatibility clause in the ways that we most specifically think about it in the life of our church, which has to do with same-sex weddings. And so our Book of Discipline has specific provisions that prohibit same-sex weddings in United Methodist churches and by United Methodist pastors. So United Methodist pastors that preside over same-sex weddings, that's a chargeable offense. And also specifically with regard to ordination. And so our Book of Discipline prohibits by its terms the ordination of self-avowed practicing homosexuals. That's its words. Which to me, I mean, even today we're like, that doesn't even, that's so inaccurate in and of itself when we know so much more about sexual identity and orientation. But be that as may, I'm teaching history here, that's my job. So, so these provisions are in our Book of Discipline, and they've been controversial, and there have been pushes back and forth ever since 1972. And we know that there are advocacy groups that have developed, and so things like Reconciling Ministries Network, which I think this church is a member of Topeka, Lawrence First, and some other churches in our area. And there are advocacy groups that have been on sort of the other side, if you want to call it, of the issue, like Good News, who have worked to try to keep what they feel is a traditional view of theology in this regard. And so these debates have been ongoing since 1972. Again, I started as a delegate alternate delegate in 2012 was the first time I got to go to a general conference down in Tampa. But I know it's been going on every, I think, quadrennia since then. But maybe with the changes that we saw in particularly in the United States and in Europe, but particularly in the United States, we see maybe this issue coming more to the forefront by 2008 and especially by 2012. And so we really saw a lot of activity. You see the pictures and history of protests on the floor of General Conference, disrupting General Conference by 2008 and 2012, and real situations where there's real conflict at General Conference. So again, my first time going to General Conference is in 2012. I was an alternate delegate, so I was primarily up in the stands. But I do remember walking away from that thinking, this is broken. I mean, this system is broken. And I don't know that this can really continue on at that point. But there were people who were working to see if there were still some ways forward for us at that point. So I think that's where I would end with 2012. Yeah, not a very upbeat ending there to transition over to you on.
Well, let me get things to go worse. Actually, I think if I had been a delegate in 2012, I may not have wanted to be a delegate in 2016, because I know that was very difficult, including, I think, for the first time in General Conference history, they had to actually stop a session partway through because the protests were loud enough that they weren't able to continue in a meaningful way. So the protests in 2012 were very significant, and in 2016, it just got to be more so. The most important books could be written about the last 6 years of the United Methodist Church, and you don't want to hear a book today. So I'm going to try to really compact this. The most significant piece that happened in 2016, perhaps, was actually not on the floor of General Conference. There were, that's kind of often true. At General Conference, you know, it's our legislative body, and you can think about it similar perhaps to the halls of Congress, where yes, there's votes that are taken, and you pretty much know before the vote's taken what the vote's going to be, and a lot of work happens off the floor, informally, with people talking to other people. So there was a meeting that happened away from General Conference during that time, though, between some of the significant leaders of the more traditionalist wing of the church, some of the significant leaders of the more progressive wing, and some bishops. And they basically decided together that the denomination needed to split. But they were secret meetings. And then word got out about these meetings, and a lot of folks weren't real happy with that. So the bishops, Bishop O was his name, from I think Wisconsin at the time, he shared on the floor of General Conference from the Council of Bishops that these meetings had taken place, and that they had planned on making a recommendation to the General Conference to effectively disband the denomination. And they instead opted not to do that, but they made a statement, kind of a pastoral statement, about the state of our brokenness. And that was on a Tuesday morning, I believe. And then Tuesday afternoon, there was a motion. Mark Holland, who is from our conference here in the Great Plains, Mark Holland made a motion to ask the bishops to give us a path forward, basically. And they accepted the motion. That passed. There's no substance to it, but they agreed to talk more that evening. They came back the next day, and ultimately, sparing you the gory details, it was part of a 2-day process that ultimately resulted in the bishops creating a task force that eventually recommended the special session of General Conference in 2019, where we would focus strictly on the question of how do we, or do we, as a denomination, move forward together. And all the legislation that had to do with LGBT ministry and people was tabled in 2016 until after the 2019 Special General Conference. So this may get into some territory that you're more familiar with. We have the 2019 special session. There were 3 proposals from the task force, plus there was one more that came from a group of progressives. There was the One Church plan, which I was a supporter of and worked very hard on. There was a traditional plan, which is ultimately what passed. There was the Connectional Conference plan, which was kind of like a GMC and a UMC, but they were technically the same denomination. It's kind of a one denomination, but with 2 theological divisions. And then the simple plan was brought by a group of progressive delegates. And ultimately, the traditional plan passed. It's important that some of the provisions, many of the provisions of the traditional plan were ruled unconstitutional and never took effect. Some of them have taken effect, but of course, what was really clear was that this is the path that we're on. Like, whether they officially took effect or not, the will of the General Conference was clear. One of the things that did take effect was an exit plan, which is now known as paragraph 2553, and that's a piece that requires that if a church were to exit, they would have to pay 2 years of apportionments, and their pension obligations as a minimum, and then possibly more than that if the conference asked for more than that. But some of the provisions of the traditional plan were unconstitutional, but if it was fully enacted, the traditional plan would include things like, for example, if you serve on the Board of Ordained Ministry, which is the group that chooses whether or not a person should be ordained, then you would have to sign a pledge, basically, that you would not approve somebody who's gay. If you're a bishop, if you're a bishop and you ordain somebody who is gay, you wouldn't even have to, technically, you would not have even had to have known necessarily that this was somebody who was a self-avowed practicing homosexual. And you could be kicked out of being a bishop. Some of us, you will hear, although I'm sure that Randall, as well as myself, we'll do our best to be unbiased in this, and we also have a bias as humans. It was sometimes referred to as a mean-spirited plan, and I believe it was mean-spirited. I mean, it was it's going to be flat out enforced, and that's the way it's going to be. So, but here's what happened. That was the end of General Conference 2019. And then there was an uproar because I think what happened was that a lot of people realized, you know, I might be somebody who has a more traditional view on this, but I don't want to be mean about it. Like I'm not sure if I want my pastor to be gay, but I know that I have a son or a daughter or a niece or a nephew who's gay, and I want them to know that they can come to the church that I'm at. So I think there are some people who have a more traditional mindset who maybe had some of those thoughts as well. And there was, at the annual conferences, so our Great Plains Annual Conference, for example, there was a complete rebellion. And I don't have another word for it besides just a rebellion. When we elect delegates to General Conference, usually it takes a while. Like, it could take 20 ballots before you have your group elected. In the Missouri Conference, which is not known as a bastion of progressive thought necessarily, right? In the Missouri Conference, they elected their clergy delegates on the first ballot. They elected their lay delegates on the first ballot. And every one of those elections was somebody who was progressive or centrist. I'll call myself centrist more so. I'm progressive on the question of inclusion. Overall, my theology is more traditional, so I'll call myself more centrist. But I was on vacation, and I was getting these text messages. They're like, you'll never guess what happened in Missouri. And they were right. I would never have guessed it. And it happened all over the country, so that in the United States, we're divided into 5 jurisdictions, and our bishops are elected by the jurisdictions. So we have in our jurisdiction, the South Central jurisdiction, we're the northernmost part of that. It's Kansas and Nebraska, Missouri, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana, New Mexico.
That's it.
I got them all. Our jurisdiction, along with the other 4 jurisdictions as well, had we had General Conference in 2020 and had we had jurisdictional conference where we elected bishops, we have a supermajority in all of those jurisdictions of progressives and centrists. So that literally every bishop, had we elected bishops in 2020, every bishop who had been elected would be somebody of whom the question would be asked, will you enforce the portion of the book of discipline that the traditionalist plan has taken effect on? And any bishop who said yes to that would not be elected. Because the elections for the General Conference delegations and for the jurisdictional conference delegations were that clear. And that had never happened before. And for the traditionalist leadership, that's a terrifying thing, because what that means, I mean, that's where the enforcement mechanisms come from. So what that means is that they could pass anything they wanted to at General Conference, but there wouldn't be bishops who would follow that. Excuse me. There wouldn't be bishops who would follow that. So, like, it just didn't matter anymore. And so I think that that's why they were willing to come to the table. There was one thing that everybody agreed to in 2019 is that everybody lost. Nobody won. It was painful. I went back for a blog that I was writing. I went back and I watched about an hour and a half of it, and I think that until my mom died last September, I think that's the last time I cried. And I was literally in tears. Everybody lost. And so understanding that everybody lost, and we can't do this to ourselves, we can't do this to each other anymore, a group got together and tried to establish the protocol, which Randall's going to talk about.
Yeah, so after that experience, and then, traditionalists sort of prevailed in St. Louis in 2019, and then you see a different result, particularly among delegation elections in the United States in 2019 after that, sort of in response maybe to that. There's sort of this impasse that we're at. And so, like David said, I think that sort of brings some people to the table maybe that wouldn't have, because, on one hand, maybe if you're a traditionalist, you say, look, we've got the votes, and even after General Conference delegations, I think the estimates were that there wouldn't have been sufficient numbers to, for example, get rid of the incompatibility clause at General Conference, in large part because of delegates from outside of the United States. So on one hand, you might say, well, why would they even come to the table? And for the reasons that David said, is at least partially because within the United States, where we elect our bishops, it looked like it would be very different in a way that wasn't acceptable. And so it sort of brings everybody finally maybe to a table. And one of the sort of things that we try to figure out is, I don't think very many people have ever been sort of wanting to say we all have to be together all the time. We have what? Okay, thank you for letting me know. Am I on? Is that good? Thank you. Keep letting me know, please. Nobody necessarily ever thought that, we all have to be together. There's how many different denominations here in Lawrence, right? There's we can do a lot of different things as the Church of Christ. That's okay. But anytime you start talking about property and money and authority and power, those discussions, I think, get more difficult. And so those are some of the things that we have to think about, particularly, David said we can only agree about one thing at St. Louis, which was that we lost, which I certainly agree with that. But the other thing we sort of agreed with was we have to take care of our pension liability, which sounds really dry a lot of times, but it's really not. It's about our covenant with clergy that have spent years, decades sometimes, serving our churches, and the idea that we can just walk away from those responsibilities. I think there was some agreement in St. Louis that no, that's not what we want to be. So sort of trying to figure out how we can do some of these things and extract ourselves if we were going to split in some way. So there was a group of people assembled by Bishop Yambasu, sorry. And it included different people from across the jurisdiction, but it was a small group. And it was facilitated by a lawyer, of all people, named Feinstein, I think, from Chicago, who was famous or had a lot of experience doing mediation and negotiation in highly sensitive topics like 9/11 compensation and things like that. These things where there's high emotions, but hoping to be able to find ways forward. And so the bishop called this group together, and it's sort of he named them, and there's some discussion about whether that's a very good process. But in any case, this group in late 2019, I think, came out with a proposal. And there were other proposals that were coming out. They were different. There's Indianapolis. There were different proposals that were coming out from different areas. But this thing called the Protocol for Reconciliation, or I'll just call it the Protocol, came out from this small group with interested stakeholders from all sides, really. And it came forward as a way to try to find a way to split our property and things like that in a way for churches that wanted to leave, in a way that would also take care of pension liability. I don't want to get too I'll get as technical as you want later, but as technical as I can get without being Scott Brewer. but the idea that, if we had a denomination, we had an organization and an agreement as to how we would deal with pension liability, we might be able to do it in a way that's more cost effective than it will be if people just leave our denomination. And so this group put forward this protocol. It had mechanisms for how it had mechanisms for how annual conferences could decide whether or not to leave the United Methodist Church. And then if they did, how local churches could decide whether or not to stay with their annual conference, depending on what their annual conference did. It gave mechanisms for how clergy could decide where they wanted to land, and it gave mechanisms for how we would deal with the pension liability. And so, as most sort of negotiated compromises go, there were things in it that nobody agreed with everything in it. But it felt like in early 2020 that there was some movement that we thought that this could be maybe a way out. Maybe this could garner a majority of delegates at a 2020 General Conference in Minnesota. It certainly had support really from traditionalist leadership and from progressive leadership and centrist leadership. It included and the expectation that there would be at least one new denomination, what we would call now the Global Methodist Church, but maybe others, maybe some more progressive denominations, that there would be the creation of some new, at least one, maybe more denominations, and this would give landing places for people who no longer wanted to be part of a United Methodist Church, that it would provide funding for particularly this new, what we call Global Methodist Church today, but also some other denominations, that it would provide some funding for racial reconciliation efforts on the part of our church. And so there was some movement on this that we thought, at least I thought, this has a real chance. It seemed like the leaders of a lot of the interest groups were getting behind this. And so our delegation voted in support of the protocol. And so it felt like going into May, maybe that would be our way forward, that we would have a protocol. And you had discussions about it here maybe in 2020 or 2019. And so we thought maybe that was the way forward. And then COVID happened.
Yeah, so we were all set, I think, for 2020. And I think if we had a 2020 General Conference, I'm pretty sure that the protocol would have passed. It is important. I want to add one piece to the protocol because this is really important to me. There was an initial protocol agreement, and then there was the protocol legislation. And sometimes I make the comparison to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. So we all know bits of the Declaration of Independence. It's a beautiful statement. It's a wonderful statement. And in terms of law, it's meaningless. What matters for law is the Constitution, right? So if the Declaration of Independence says something, but it's not backed up by the Constitution, from a legal standpoint, it doesn't matter. So one of the pieces that was in the protocol's original language was an acknowledgement that we would have a regionalization. For the long term, what needed to happen for progressives and centrists for the long term was that in the United States, we could make one decision, and in Africa, they could make it, or actually one of the different they're called central conferences. In Africa, they could make decisions. Philippines could make a decision. Europe could make a decision. Eastern Europe could make a decision. So regionalization, and that's an important piece in the original language. But there was not a legislative way to make that happen within the confines of 2020. So that wasn't in the legislative portion of the protocol. The idea was that the protocol would pass in 2020, and then we would immediately have a new conference for those who would be choosing to leave, and then those of us who chose to stay could start to rebuild what's next. But we never got there. So, of course, COVID came, and so in March of 2020, the Council of Bishops, actually, it's called the General Commission on General Conference, rescheduled the General Conference for 2021. The bishops were anxious about that, and so the bishops could schedule a special session of General Conference, just like they did for 2019. So they scheduled a special session of General Conference for May of 2021. And the idea was that it would be a couple of days long. It would be an online special conference that would have the sole purpose of passing some enabling legislation that would let us have a future General Conference online. And I think part of what happened is they realized, if we have to have a special General Conference to pass the rules to let us have a General Conference, then maybe we can't have the special General Conference. Because that fell apart, and it didn't happen. And then, so the 2020 General Conference was postponed to May of 21, and then the May 21 conference was postponed to the fall of 21, and then in early March of 22, in February of 21, they postponed it until August of 22, and then in early March of 22, they postponed it to 2024. Now, 2024 is our next regularly scheduled General Conference, so I don't know when the 2024 conference will happen in 2028, maybe. Well, there's some technical work that needs to be done there to sort that out. But I think a couple of things that I want to share with this process. One is that officially the delay is because of COVID and because of visa issues. So I've got a friend in Nigeria. He tells me that people who are in Nigeria right now, as of a month ago, they're looking at close to a 2-year wait from the time that they apply for a visa until the time they get a visa to come to the United States. There was a suggestion from traditionalists that, well, perhaps we could move it to Zimbabwe. And there had been a plan, because we have so many United Methodists in Africa, there had been a plan for us to have a General Conference in Zimbabwe. Now, homosexuality is illegal in Zimbabwe, so that may not be, as we try to think about how can we be friendly for people who identify as LGBT, maybe having General Conference in a place where their being is not legal is not a good idea. So there's, all kinds of issues. That's the official reason for the delay. There are some who believe that the delay was not about that it was a strategic delay on the part of progressives and centrists. My perspective is that that's not the case. But I think what's important about that is that you hear the lack of trust between the two groups. And, without getting into, who's right, who's wrong, we're probably both wrong. I mean, there's probably things we could all look back on and say, yeah, we probably should have said that different or done that different. But I think, again, one of the places that we can all agree to is that the trust level that we have, it would be hard for it to be lower. That's part of why a special online General Conference couldn't happen, because had that happened, then you would have people who are gathered in different parts of the world without having oversight. We know in 2019 there were 4 delegates from one country who afterwards it was discovered were fraudulently there. They had not been elected. They were sitting in for people who were elected, but they themselves hadn't been elected. I watched in 2019 as somebody was hovering over the desk of some delegates from Africa, and what it looked like to me was that he was making sure they voted the way they were supposed to vote. I don't know that he did that, but it's my perception. So, and what I want you to hear is that whether I was right or wrong about that perception, it's the lack of trust that is so problematic. So, and I acknowledge that for myself. I have that lack of trust, and other people have that lack of trust in me. So that's a huge part of why we are where we are. So moving from the delay into what happens now, of course, today, May 1st, this is the first day for the existence officially of the Global Methodist Church. It now is in existence, and my understanding is that earlier today, Bishop Mike Lowry, who's a retired bishop from last serving in the Central Texas Conference, has turned in his credentials as a United Methodist pastor and as a bishop of the church to join the Global Methodist Church. Keith Boyette, who's the president of their Transitional Leadership Council, it's called, has done likewise. He's an ordained United Methodist, well, until today, was an ordained United Methodist clergy person, and has turned in his credentials so that he can join that church. So it is official now. In the United Methodist Church, officially, the status quo stays in place for 2 more years. Importantly, for those who identify as LGBT, that means the abeyance stays in effect. If you're not familiar with that language, that's an informal agreement among bishops that they will not have church charges against a pastor who is a self-avowed practicing homosexual or against clergy for performing same-sex marriages. General Conference 2024 may or may not pass the protocol. I'm pretty confident it would have passed in 2020, but Bishop Yavasu, who formed that group, died since then. Junius Dotson, a member of our conference who was on that group, he's died since then. I mean, two of the key people have passed away. Part of that plan was a $25 million kind of starting fund for the new traditional denomination. Well, as a denomination, we've made a $30 million agreement to settle with the Boy Scouts complaint. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that or not, but so, there's a lot of life that's happened in the last couple of years, yeah? So just because it seemed like the right plan in 2020 doesn't mean it's the right plan in 2022, much less 2024. So it may or may not pass. General Conference 2024 may or may not pass more inclusive language. We just don't know for sure. And my hunch is that the most likely scenario would be that in 2024 we start a process for the regionalization that I mentioned before, and that regionalization will be complete in probably 2025 because of our system. We can talk about details later if you want to, but our system would mean that it would need to have a vote at annual conferences, so it would start in 2025, and then would be fully ratified with language changes for the United States in 2028. And that would be language then that would allow for LGBT plus pastors and allow, not mandate, but allow pastors to perform same-sex marriages. And that still feels for some folks like a very long time away. It's also much closer than what it has been before. So, and again, that's not, my crystal ball's not very good so far. So, but that's what it seems to me like is most likely for 2024. But in terms of the GMC, Randall?
Yeah. So I'll add one thing on to what you said, though. The other sort of thing that's happened with the postponed general conferences is we also postponed our jurisdictional conferences. Because usually our jurisdictional conferences occur after our general conference. That's where the main thing we do is elect bishops. And so, we have a certain number of bishops who retire every year, and so we need to elect some new bishops generally. And in fact, we have bishops who want to retire, and some bishops who finally said, I'm not continuing to do this anymore. And so when there's a vacancy, you have to do something. If we can't elect new bishops, then you have to figure out something else. So, for example, that's why right now our Bishop Reuben Sines is our bishop, and he's the bishop for Central Texas. Why? Because Mike Lowry, that was his jurisdiction, his conference, retired. But we haven't been able to elect a new bishop. We interviewed bishop candidates as a delegation in 2019. We're getting ready to do that, but then everything has stopped. So one of the questions we have is whether or not our general conference has been postponed. There are still people who are hoping we'll have a jurisdictional conference, maybe even this year in the fall, to elect bishops. And our judicial council is right now actually considering whether that can happen or not. So that's another possibility, one of those other things we don't know. We might, maybe this delegation will get to actually meet and live out its election a little bit. Maybe not. We'll see. So really, the Global Methodist Church, I would say, its history actually goes back a little bit. I mean, it really starts with maybe 2017 when you start thinking about the Wesleyan Covenant Association, sorry. I think a lot of those leaders, particularly as they were looking forward to 2019, contemplated the possibility that there might have been changes in 2019, that the one church plan might have passed. A lot of us thought it might have passed. People worked really hard on it, and we were counting the votes. So we thought it was possible that it could pass. And a lot of the WCA leaders had contemplated that possibility and had really set up that if that happened, we're leaving, we're going to start a new denomination. So a lot of the infrastructure for a new denomination was already in the works, even as early as 2019, really. But then, to the surprise of some, the traditionalists sort of carried the day in St. Louis. So they didn't have to sort of make that happen at that point. But then the other history you've heard has happened. Certainly, I think a lot of the traditionalists were supporting, and still are supporting, wishing that we would have General Conference so that the protocol could have passed, because they're ready to start a new denomination. With the last announcement of postponement of our General Conference till 2024, that leadership group announced that, all right, well, we think the time is now. We're not going to wait any longer. And so the announcement was made that the Global Methodist Church starts today. May 1st, 2022 is their birth date. And so what does that mean? That means there's a new denomination today, I guess, that they're going to incorporate and start taking steps towards being a church denomination. They have a book of discipline. David has studied it a lot more than I have. Its differences and things like that from our polity. I couldn't tell you a lot about it. But this will be a place where many churches may want to land. Now, as David said, in 2019, there was an exit provision as part of what happened in St. Louis 2019. And so we have a disaffiliation process. We already have a disaffiliation process. We didn't need the protocol for that. The protocol just makes disaffiliation easier, I think, for a lot of local churches, and makes it possible for annual conferences, for example, to disaffiliate. But we already had a procedure in 2553 for disaffiliation. And in fact, several churches in the Great Plains Annual Conference have already done this. I don't know numbers-wise. It's a dozen, 15, 20, something like that. Mostly pretty small churches around the conference, but have disaffiliated already. They've gone through the process of finding out what they need to contribute towards pension liabilities, and they're part of their financial contributions, and so forth. And so they've already disaffiliated. And so some of them, I suppose, could today join the Global Methodist Church. I haven't kept up on the news. I don't know if that's what any of them are planning to do. But that could happen today, because now there's a place for them to go. Or maybe they're going to continue as independent churches, or maybe they're going to join some other expression. We don't know. So what's this sort of status today? We have a disaffiliation process. We have a church that maybe some churches, a new denomination that some churches will want to land in. And so we might see this process accelerating around our conference and really around the denomination. The idea that some churches have been waiting, hoping that the protocol would pass, that would be a more cost-effective maybe way when they decided to disaffiliate. But now maybe they're not waiting. And in fact, my understanding from conference staff is that it's actually gotten a little bit cheaper, quite a bit cheaper to disaffiliate. So some of the financial sort of hassles might be a little less. So we will see in the next few years. Churches, I think, not waiting for 2024. And in fact, our conference leadership, the bishop has already called a special session of our annual conference in September, anticipating that there will be some number of churches who will choose to disaffiliate. And certainly the philosophy and action, I think, of our conference leadership has been, we don't want anybody to leave, but we also aren't going to make it difficult or hold anybody hostage. We don't, if people don't want to be here, we don't want to hold people here. And so I think our conference staff, Scott Brewer, and our Board of Trustees Chair, Stephanie Alschweid, have gone to great steps to have a process in place for churches that either have already discerned that they want to disaffiliate, or in the next 12 months or so want to disaffiliate, that there's a process to do that. They contact conference staff, and they can get sort of the numbers as far as the financial aspects of that. They contact their district superintendent and go through a process with the district superintendent to go through a meeting. And then a local church has to make a decision. And I think we got a question ahead of time about who makes the decision within a local church. And part of the process that's laid out by our annual conference requires that it be a congregational decision, that there has to be a church conference called. And the church conference under our process, I think, has to be a 2/3 vote right now. And so a local church can do that. So that's sort of where we're at within our conference right now, is we expect that there were already churches in that process of discernment. Some of them have already finished it, and voted, and they were voted on by annual conference last year. Some of them, I assume, are in that process right now and may be ready in the next few months. Some of them, based on this announcement in the last few months, may accelerate that process in the next few months and be ready to seek annual conference approval by September. And there may be some who are just maybe even starting that discernment process. If you're like my church, we just don't talk about these things at all. That's how we deal with it. But maybe we will, right, in the next year. That provision from 2553 expires at the end of 2023. And so certainly churches that want to take advantage of that disaffiliation process, they do need to be thinking about it and need to be processing that by the end of 2023. Maybe that means by summer 2023 to get annual conference approval. I don't know. It's interesting to me as I talk to conference leaders who, I mean, I appreciate I'm nobody. There's no reason for them to talk to me in any great language. But even so there's a lot of hypotheticals about how many churches are going to leave? How many churches are going to leave? And the answer is, nobody knows for sure. I mean, I think there are estimates, and I've heard lots of different estimates from people who are actually pretty in the know. I get pretty different estimates sometimes. And, so we've already seen, I think, 12 or 15, something like that, disaffiliate. We have every reason to think there would be some number of that more. Maybe it would be as many as 100 churches, maybe even somewhat more by the sort of end of the 2553 process, which is a lot. But on the other hand, we have like 1,000 churches in the Great Plains Annual Conference. And so when we think about it in the context of that, it may be that it's not that bad. And it's different. We'll talk more about the effect of all of this on other conferences, on our conference and on other conferences a little bit later. So anyway, that's sort of what I think about the status of the Global Methodist Church and what we know about our disaffiliation process. There's a lot more information out on the conference website. Todd and the staff just uploaded frequently asked questions document a week ago, 10 days, something like that ago, which answers all your questions. We didn't really need to have this meeting. We could have just said, see document on the website, and it's going to answer, especially all the detailed questions that the conference can answer, at least at this point. And they said, and they promised that they will be updating that as they get more information from the Judicial Council about whether we'll have jurisdictional conference and different things like that, as some of these questions maybe get answered down the road.
Yeah, some of them we don't have a firm answer to until some other decisions are made. I do think one of the important things would be if your local church, I'm looking at your cheat sheet, if you're a local church and you're interested in the possibility of the Global Methodist Church, the best thing to do would be to talk to your district superintendent. If you're a layperson, talk to your pastor, please. As a pastor, we always appreciate that, but your district superintendent will be equipped for that. I don't think there's any reason, if you know that you want to leave, I think the only reason to not leave immediately would be so that you have a chance to get the information that you need. And what I mean by that is, like Randall said, I've read through it's called the Transitional Book of Doctrine and Discipline, and there are a lot of rumors around that don't bear fruit. So one of those, for example, is that apportionments are going to be much less in the Global Methodist Church. It's not true. There's some conferences where apportionments could very well be higher. And in this conference, they would be essentially unchanged. They might go down 1.5%. So that's one example. That churches will have much more say over who their pastors are going to be. It's not true. At least for the Transitional Book of Doctrine and Discipline, it's essentially an identical process to what we use today in the United Methodist Church. So I would encourage you, if you're thinking about it, to just get as much information as you can get to make sure you're making as educated of a decision as you can make.
So we sort of had it laid out to think about, all right, that's where we're at. So what kind of things what are the impacts of these things on some different groups? So I was going to talk about what the impact might be on, average layperson in your church. David's going to talk a little bit about things that maybe clergy people should be thinking about. So from a layperson standpoint, of course, as lay people, we could choose to leave our church anytime we want, right? We're not, I could choose to transfer my membership somewhere else. And if there's a new Global Methodist Church and that's where I feel aligned to do, I could do that. So I guess that's a thing I need to be thinking about now as a layperson, that there's going to be this other expression out there. And, is that where I want to be, or do I want to stay UMC? That's a decision that I'm going to have to make in the not too distant future. I've already made that decision. But people are going to have to be making that decision. You don't if you're happy with the United Methodist Church that you're in, and it stays the United Methodist Church, then you don't have to do anything. You're fine. It's not going to be a time where you have to do that necessarily. But if your church is making a decision, then we'll have to. So we'll talk more about if the local church is making a decision. But what are some of the things that you as a clergy person? Because lay people I can go to another church, but clergy people have a whole different world to think about.
Clergy,
right?
it's more complicated. The short version for the clergy is that our annual conference isn't going to go anyplace. The Great Plains Conference, there's no question, will stay within the United Methodist Church. So for a clergy person, the only reason you would need to do something is if you want to go to the Global Methodist Church, and if that's the case, I would Google Global Methodist Church and find out from them what you have to do, and talk to your district superintendent.
And what the ramifications of it on your pension are.
Yeah, and some of that, again, some of that we don't
like
know.
That.
But yeah, I don't feel like I'm really equipped to be able to answer that level of depth that a clergy person would need to be considering for certainly pension is the kind of thing that could be important. But I see a handful of clergy, but not very many, so I don't want to spend too much time on that.
We talked about our local churches already a little bit, what decisions do they have to make? Again, I agree with David. I think it very unlikely that our annual conference is going to make any sort of move to leave the United Methodist Church, even if it could. I don't think that's likely. But some number of local churches are going to be making the decision, and so that's a discernment process that's going to be going on out in different churches, depending on your church, obviously. I think another interesting, and I haven't heard a lot of conversation about this, that we talk a lot about churches leaving, but we don't talk about members leaving necessarily so much. And that's a different metric to be thinking about that. I think a lot, even like in Topeka, I'm not really sure that there are any churches in Topeka where I'm from that are likely to go to the Global Methodist Church. Maybe there are some, but I don't know if there are. But there's a lot of people who I think would, a lot of members who will. And so even if no churches in Topeka sort of go to the Global Methodist Church, particularly if no churches in Topeka go to the Global Methodist Church, I think that's probably a new church plant for the Global Methodist Church, right? That there will be a Global Methodist Church in Topeka. It's a big enough place. There's enough people. And I think there would be a critical mass of people. And so even if none of my church or none of my churches, the churches in my area, necessarily go that way, there probably will be, and some people will go that way because that's where they're led and their discernment process takes them. And so that's still going to have an effect on my local church, right? Even if my local church doesn't leave, we may see some differences in membership. Now, we might see differences in membership because if there are some changes that are more inclusive that may help us draw in some people who have left my church because of our current denominational stance and things like that. So I don't know where that lands, but that's at least something that I'm thinking about from our local church standpoint. You want to talk about the effect you think on the annual conference? You've talked about this a little bit, but do you think on the health of the annual conference?
Let me just do this briefly, and then let's get questions that you have. So for the Great Plains Annual Conference, there will be churches that leave. It'll be less than 10% most likely. We're in a financially good place, as I understand things. We're in a spiritually good place. We have good leadership. So for the Great Plains Conference standpoint, I have zero concern. I'm just being honest. I don't have concern about what it's going to be like. It's going to be different. We're going to be fine. For those in the conference who choose to leave and go to the Global Methodist Church, and Randall said they'll make plans for that. So I think they'll be covered. And there's a lot of questions beyond that too. For the jurisdiction, for the general conference, what's the future look like? I don't know. I don't think we can. If you asked me in 2019, I would not have said, well, part of the future is going to be a global pandemic, right? So, but here's what we do know. We do know the one in whose hands the future lies. And that's where and I think for the Global Methodist Church and for the UMC, we can all agree with that we know whose hands the future lies in. And we're going to be okay. So can we leave that there right now and then take questions?
Sure.
We got about half an
So
hour.
if you have a question, we'd like you to raise your hand and we'll bring you the mic, or Janelle will gather your questions if you have them written down. And we have two mics. So we have two ways if you have questions, and But raise your hand so we can make sure people hear your question.
And I like cards because that helps you to think through your question more fully.
What is the future of the United Methodist Publishing House?
That's an interesting question. The United Methodist Publishing House, as I understand it, is not really funded by our apportionment dollars anymore. It's self-standing, and like a lot of publishing houses, it's not in great financial shape because the publishing industry is changing a lot. So I don't know an answer to that question beyond I know that they're struggling like a lot of other publishing companies are.
We've seen, I mean, it's an example, we've seen other agencies or things like that try to position themselves in places where they could serve more than the United Methodist Church. The Board of Pensions, for example, is Westpath and the idea. But I'm not aware of that group, of that board sort of doing that. Yeah.
They'll have a harder time doing that because one of the things that's happened historically, and we could talk for a long time about some of the history of this, and the traditionalist branch within the denomination has spent years and years establishing kind of a shadow institution, frankly. So they've got a group called Seedbed, which is a publisher that incorporated Bristol House Books, I think, was a publisher. They've got their own version of United Methodist Women, of the Global Board of Missions. They've got a whole separate structure, and so I don't think that they're going to be able to do that probably in the same way. A couple of questions from ahead of time that I think we can answer quickly that people had. Randall already did this one kind of, how does each congregation decide what they're going to do? If you feel compelled to take a vote in your congregation, it would be a church conference vote. But I will say too, at Old Mission where I serve, we're very much a purple congregation. I suspect if we took a vote that it would be, I don't know, 75-25 to stay maybe, something like that. 75-25 maybe on the more progressive side, but I don't plan on us taking a vote, because here's what I know. I know personally, I know a church where there was a person at a church council meeting where they were talking about inclusion, and there was a person who said, I just don't think I want one of them sitting by me in the pews. And now, I'm just going to leave that there and let you decide for yourself who they meant when they said, I don't want one of them sitting by me in the pews. Did they mean somebody who was gay, or did they mean somebody who they thought was a bigot? Either way, how does the person who hears that, just like you did, go to worship with that same person the next week? I think there's a lot of harm that we can cause by having church votes where people say things that aren't fully thought out. So I would encourage, I mean, if your church really is like a 50-50 split, God bless you, and good luck. But if there's not a really compelling reason to think that your church would vote to leave the denomination, I really hope you'll think hard about whether or not to have that vote, because I think a lot of harm could be done. There was a question from First Church here about how long will we have to wait for the change to the Book of Discipline for full inclusion. We kind of answered that one. I think it's going to be a while still, but informally things can continue. And then there was a question about, there's been talk about possibility of churches being part of both the UMC and the GMC. How would that work? The answer is it really wouldn't. And there is such a thing as a federated church, where a church is part of more than one denomination. So you might have in a smaller town a Lutheran church and a Methodist church get together and share a pastor, and there's a process for doing that. But I think I would just suggest that in the throes of a divorce, probably it's not a good decision to try to immediately reconcile. So I don't think, while technically it's possible, I would be absolutely shocked if any bishop in the country were to allow that arrangement. If you need to leave, then God bless you as you go. Don't leave, but not really leave. Otherwise, stay. So, some of those. You want to grab a question and see what we can do?
Nobody told me there was reading involved. I didn't bring my readers in. When will the Great Plains Conference begin being open in the appointment of clergy without regard to sexual orientation and allowing weddings without regard to sexual orientation? I mean, as far as whether the discipline changes, I mean, that's sort of what David was answering. I guess do you have any other comment on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the answer is now. So Bishop Sines is following the idea of the abeyance. And what that means is that although I've not done so, if I were to leave here and go to marry 2 men or marry 2 women, and I called up Bishop Sines and said, just, hey, wanted to let you know that I'm about to do this wedding, then Bishop Sines would say, well, okay, thanks for letting me know. And that would be the end of the conversation. And in terms of ordination, my go-to line is that I say, the only thing that changes for ordination is that the next time you have a pastor who's gay, you're more likely to know it. I'm not joking, every church that not necessarily when I've been on staff, but every church that I have served has had a pastor on staff who's gay, that I'm aware of. The church as a whole may not have been, but that means there's also those who I was not aware of, right? So the next time you have a pastor who is gay, because you already have, I guarantee it, the next time you have one, you're more likely to know it. Those appointments have always been made, sometimes with the bishop's knowledge and sometimes without.
The next question is, will the Global Methodist Church support Umcor? And I don't know what the Global Methodist Church has said with regard to whether it wants to be involved in Umcor.
They've at least given lip service to it. There's nothing in their book of discipline that references Umcor, so it's not set in stone. They do have an organization that kind of mimics Umcor, but those of you who know Umcor, I don't know anybody who knows about Umcor who doesn't love it. They have a kind of a similar organization, but it's not the same kind of thing. So I wouldn't be surprised if they support it, but it's not set.
This one is, our question is property ownership and what will happen with property held in trust. Well, that's a lot of the big question of how does our trust clause in the United Methodist Church operate, if it does. And I mean, generally speaking, our understanding is that all of our United Methodist churches are held in trust for the annual conference, that every bit of asset, property, real, and so forth is held in trust for the conference. So that's why we need these processes. It's held in trust for the conference. The conference can decide to let things go then. I mean, that's an option. And so we can have some processes, and that's what part of what that paragraph 2553 is to say, here's sort of what the processes might be so that at the end of it, we can release the trust clause. And in fact, that's one of the last things, the legal things that happens in the disaffiliation process that our Board of Trustees has set out, is to be able to say, all right, if you've done all these things, then we will execute the documents that can release that property and in full. So whatever your property is and other assets that you have, it can be released out of that trust clause. I mean, this is an issue, and again, I'm not in the conference staff, so I don't know. I'm a lawyer, but I'm not that kind of lawyer. As far as I know there are people in the world who question whether that trust clause is enforceable, and it might be different in different jurisdictions. I think I've heard that's a little bit what's going on in Missouri. There are some things like this going on in Missouri. But, I think certainly the goal of our conference staff, as I've seen it, is to try to avoid litigation and find ways to if we're ready to part ways, just taking care of our responsibilities, our mutual responsibilities. And if that's done, then we'll release the trust clause. That's what I've seen from the conference so far.
Yeah, there are some conferences. So 2553, that paragraph says that the minimum that a church needs to do is 2 years of apportionments and handle the pensions. There are some conferences who are adding above and beyond that some other pieces, which could include, for example, a portion of the property value and that kind of thing. I've seen no indication that our conference has any inclination to do that at all. The conference has other properties that it doesn't want, is my understanding. So that's not the case for us. I do think this is another one of those things that's kind of hidden in the Global Methodist Church. There is sort of what I call a trust clause light, because in the Global Methodist Church, so there are some churches who are wanting to leave the denomination without having to deal with the pension liability, because that's, in some places, that's a pretty big number. And interestingly, the Global Methodist Church, if a church doesn't pay their apportionments in full, they can be kicked out. And we have a lot of churches who don't pay their apportionments in full that have never been kicked out. So that's another reason your apportionments might go up, because now you have to pay them. The other thing is that they also have trust clause light. They will take a lien on your property. If you say that you want to leave the denomination, they will take out a lien on your property until you've met your pension obligations. So what's fair for the goose is fair for the gander. Whatever that expression is, you know what it means. So, yeah. Question here, does the abeyance also include performing marriage ceremonies within the local church? What I'd say is that, again, the abeyance is unofficial, so there are some bishops who aren't following the abeyance right now. But generally speaking, so a wedding is a theological moment. A wedding is a worship service. And pastors have full discretion over what happens in the context of worship within the local church. So a pastor in the United Methodist Church, a pastor has always had the right to choose whether or not to perform a wedding inside the property of a local church. The one exception, of course, being if that wedding is between two men or two women. And that's not a function of their authority within the local church. That's a function of the authority in the Book of Discipline. So I don't have any indication from Bishop Sines that he would view the abeyance any differently, whether it's inside a local church facility or whether it's someplace outside. And the other part of that is, how many of you here in Lawrence will say there's a lot of people don't get married in churches anymore. But here in Lawrence, if you're a member of Lawrence First, unless it was somebody in your immediate family, how many of you know the last wedding that Kay or Jenny did? Besides Kay, right? That's true for Old Mission where I am. I have a wedding the first weekend of June. Unless they're attending the wedding, they're not going to know. And I don't say that to say, see, we can just keep things from behind their back. I'm saying that because I think the average church member, is it that big of a deal? If there's a wedding and you don't know who it is that's married, is it that big of a deal to you on Sunday morning? What happened in that room the day before? Maybe it is. I don't know. To me, it doesn't seem like it is. I think we're out of cards. Are there other questions?
So is there a way, as the Great Plains Conference, we could more legally formalize the abeyance so that we don't have to wait to 2024 to see if the annual conference takes care of that issue? Because I hear a lot of angst in I'm tired of waiting and saying I'm a part of the organization who on paper isn't what we locally here are practicing.
Yeah, I think the answer is no. I mean, I don't think there's a way like our conference can officially in some way say that these things can't be enforced, that our judicial council wouldn't approve that. They would say that's against the discipline. You can have aspirational, that our conference can pass aspirational things saying, maybe we hope, we encourage our bishop to continue the abeyance, but that in the structure that we have, that our annual conference can't sort of make that unilateral decision in an official way, if I'm understanding your question, to like make it, that's the law here. We don't get to do that according to the Judicial Council.
Only the General Conference can change the Book of Discipline. So the Book of Discipline will continue to say what it says until 24. And there's a good chance that it will continue to say that for 4 more years after that because of the processes that we have to go through for those changes. So, having said that, in the former Kansas East Conference where we're located, we have a long history here of having resolutions to our annual conference that are promoting equality, of taking this general conference, and when we became the Great Plains Conference in 2015, sure. I think, whenever that was, we did the same thing. In 2015, at that annual conference, we passed another resolution with Kansas West and Nebraska together as one conference that said we believe that we should have a more equal relationship than we have, and the law is not going to be able to change, so to speak, until probably 2028, 2024 at the earliest.
My answer is based, by the way, some conferences tried.
Yeah, and weren't able to.
The Judicial Council said, no, you can't change the Book of Discipline. You can't tell a bishop or a part of your annual conference to not enforce the discipline. That would not be consistent with the discipline.
There will be some pastors.
I'm sorry?
Yes.
But it's totally unofficial. It's totally informal.
Yeah, the abeyance, because the Book of Discipline says these are chargeable offenses, the Book of Discipline, yeah. Now, the Book of Discipline also says, the Book of Discipline says lots of things. One of the things that the Book of Discipline says is that as pastors, we have to encourage infant baptism. And I could name 2 churches in Texas right now. Well, I can't name them right now, but I have them on my computer at home that on their websites talk about how they don't do infant baptisms. And nobody's bringing charges against them either. Even though that goes, baptism is about as fundamental as we have in the Methodist movement. So there's kind of a abeyance all across the theological spectrum right now. So I'm very confident that nobody has to have any fear of actual prosecution based on that in our conference. But I'm with Randall, I don't think there's a way of changing that.
All we've heard this afternoon has been the LGBTQ question. Is racism a question? Outside
Say
of
more.
culture.
Say more about that.
Are churches becoming more racially exclusive? As opposed to being integrated?
I don't know that we're becoming more racially excluded, because I think we're already about as exclusive as we can be.
Yeah.
I mean, the last couple of years, I can tell you the last couple of years as a pastor, it's not just the pandemic that's been hard for pastors. The George Floyd and the aftermath of that. And George Floyd, that's the easy one, right? You don't have to be thinking very hard to see how that was wrong. The harder ones are, there's a whole thing that I don't need to preach that sermon today.
So part of my answer to your question is, I think it's a good point. We talked a lot about, and the subject matter for the flyer said that part of what we were talking about was LGBTQ inclusion. I think a lot of traditionalists would say that they don't think that's what it's about. It's that they would say it's a lot more about biblical interpretation or authority or things like that. And that LGBTQ inclusion might be a presenting issue, but it's not. There are deeper issues. And I don't know, we can have a discussion about whether that's true or not. I certainly think there are deeper issues. And on lots of different, and across the spectrum of things of social justice. And so we have differences of opinion on things like climate change and on racial division and on abortion. And those positions have been moving with these different interest groups. So we've been really talking about LGBTQ inclusion, but it's at least fair to say there are other issues, and they're influenced by these same groups in different ways. Right? It's not monolithic necessarily. So, in the protocol, for example, there was funding for work on racial reconciliation within the denomination, recognizing racism existing within the United Methodist Church today and working to find ways to move forward on that. So that was certainly a part of that and a part of what the United Methodist Church says. I don't know what the Global Methodist Church says about that.
And part of why that was there was because there was concern that once we start handing out dollars, then oftentimes once dollars become more scarce, then the first people to not get the dollars are those who are traditionally marginalized, like those of minority races. And of course, since the protocol has kind of been scuttled, oh, by the way, we haven't heard anything else about those possibility of those dollars being spent that way. So it kind of bears out why that was important.
Did that answer your question?
I have a question regarding missions. I read online that under Insight that the Romanian Bulgarian Methodist Conference voted to leave and join the GMC. We spend millions of dollars in mission funds in those countries. Does this change that if they leave?
That's a question that would need to be directed to the places that make the decisions about those funds. So I don't think for the Great Plains Conference specifically, I don't think that we give money to those specifically. The general church, I would guess, does, and the general church would have to be the ones to make that decision. So I don't know, GBGM, the General Board of Global Ministries, would have a handle on that, and I don't know what decisions they would make. That's an interesting question. And certainly one that will happen with us with some conferences in the Philippines and some conferences in Africa as well. What else?
We can keep talking about this for hours and hours. We have.
Well, if we have no more questions, we do have an announcement. Janet wants to explain something to you.
You might have noticed our table over there with some soap, some toothbrushes, etc. And the Eudora Church was blessed with the inventory of a Colgate-Palmolive store that closed. We have already donated to 8 different charities plus Umcor. This is what's left. Please take it with you. If you have a church with a blessing box or a pantry, take it. Lots of soap, lots of toothbrushes. Thank you.
And cookies. Please take cookies.
Let me say, I'm willing to stick around. Miranda probably is too, but we're willing to stick around. And if you have an individual question you want to ask, please feel free to do that.
Yeah, if I've got, since we have just a few minutes, just the last thing I guess I would say is, I mean, we have our annual conference coming up in Omaha in a few weeks now, like 6 weeks. And Ann said at the beginning, she said she thinks, that she thought that we would be delegates in 2024. We don't know that. It's actually one of these interesting questions because they said that we've postponed our 2020 General Conference to 2024. I'm a 2020 delegate, but I don't have any reason to think that that's what I'm going to be appearing at 2024 as a 2020 delegate. Maybe we'll be having elections in 2023, but I don't think we have a lot of controversial things coming up in 2022 at our annual conference, as far as what I've heard from the planning team. But I certainly encourage churches and everybody to be there because I think we're laying the groundwork for what we probably will be having elections the next year and maybe other decisions that we'll be making in the not too distant future. So I really encourage, especially our laity, our clergy have to go, but I'm really encouraging our laity to, if you haven't planning on being an annual conference, I hope so. Not because I think there's anything particularly controversial this year or moving needles on justice this year, but laying the foundations for those relationships maybe for the next year.
And I'd like to just share that at Old Mission this morning, well, those of us who have worked on issues around inclusion and justice for many years, we have remembered and known and shared that when one part of the body hurts, the whole body hurts. And so that's one of the very real things that we face. I think it's important, and we started worship this morning at Old Mission, remembering that today, as the Global Methodist Church starts, is it's evident again that the body hurts. And I shared with them that in my family, Tracy and Sophia and I, we love each other a lot. We ask for forgiveness a lot. I found for myself, I'm doing that more and more the older I get. I don't know if it's because I stick my foot in my mouth more or if it's because I'm more aware of sticking my foot in my mouth more. And we also argue, and we're still part of the same family. And I want healing and I want reconciliation. I think we probably all do. And I'm also at the same time, I'm heartbroken that it's come to this. I really am. I think it's always tragic when a family breaks up. Or when a family feels the need to break up. And sometimes it's necessary. And even when it's necessary, it's still tragic that it's come to that. So I would ask that you would pray for, certainly for the people who identify as LGBTQ who have been hurting for many, many years. And I would also ask that you pray for everybody else who's hurting too. Because the body hurts. And when one part of the body hurts, it all hurts.
So we just say thank you to Randall and to David for being here and sharing with us this afternoon. And thank you all for spending your afternoon with us. And please do take cookies. We have lots of cookies, and we would like you to take some for your way home. And don't forget to pick up soap and other things over there as you go today. If you continue to have questions, please do contact your pastors. Your pastors will be able to either answer them or to find an answer or to say, we just don't know, which is often an answer at this point. So we thank you for that. I've invited Reverend Amy Seifert. She is the pastor over at Lawrence Central, and she is the coordinator for our network. I've asked her to come and offer our blessing as we go.
Would you pray with me? Gracious and loving God, we give you thanks for this opportunity that we have had to come together as your people, as your family, your children, as we try to navigate the changes that our denomination is facing. And God, I ask for your peace and your presence and your comfort to be upon everyone as we face these days and weeks and months of uncertainty. Because God, as David mentioned, even though we don't know what tomorrow holds, we do know that you hold tomorrow, and that your will and your will be done in all of our lives. Thank you for the gifts of David and Randall, that they have their gifts of time and knowledge that they have shared with us this day. Be with each of us as we depart from this place. Keep us mindful that we are your body and that we are your representatives. May everything we do, everything we say, and everything we are a part of reflect the light that shines through us, your light that shines through us. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Thank you again, and don't forget the cookies.